The inside of Noah's Ark was nothing like what you saw in your childhood storybooks. That peaceful, cozy, floating zoo? Quite the opposite. It was a survival system pushed to its absolute limit. Imagine thousands of predators and prey imprisoned in pitch-black darkness, while the hull violently rocks in an endless, raging ocean. Here, controlling panic wasn't just about order, it was about survival. One ventilation failure, or a fatal shift in the cargo, and this ship would instantly become a tomb for all life within. In this video, we will peel back the layers of myth and reconstruct the internal workings of this ancient vessel through reverse engineering. We will reveal technical solutions that are staggering even by today's standards, and see exactly how, in a savage era without modern technology, they ensured the continuation of life on Earth. The design: a box, not a boat. If Noah's Ark had been built like the ordinary ships we imagine, it wouldn't have lasted a week under the impact of the flood before snapping in half. But the blueprint described in the biblical text doesn't look like a boat at all. It describes a box. This counterintuitive design difference was the only thing that saved them. You must understand the core logic. In a vast ocean with absolutely no destination, the last thing you need is speed. The only thing you need is stability. Think about it. Ordinary ships have rudders and sails to choose a course and head for a port. But in the Great Flood, there were no destinations, no ports, no cities. The world had been reset to zero. The only mission of this massive structure was to simply not sink while the external world was utterly destroyed. That is why the parameters given in the Bible describe a massive rectangular box with a perfect length-to-width ratio of 6:1. If you look at the supersized cargo ships crossing the oceans today, you will be surprised to find that they use almost the exact same ratio. This is no coincidence, it is pure physics. Naval engineers call the characteristic provided by this design passive stability. In an apocalyptic ocean where waves could dwarf skyscrapers, this box shape meant that the more the hull tilted to one side, the greater the restoring force it generated to right itself. Like a tumbler toy, it automatically returned to the center, making it extremely difficult to capsize. Structural integrity. However, building a wooden box of such immense size brought a fatal engineering hazard: wood warps. When one giant wave lifts the bow and another hits the stern, the suspended middle section endures unimaginable tension. If it were a standard structure, the Ark would have snapped like a dry twig. The 3 internal decks, described in the text, were likely not just compartments for living. Engineering-wise, they acted as a massive truss, holding the outer walls together like a skeleton to prevent the hull from disintegrating under the violent tearing force of the sea. To complete the final defense, the scripture records that the Ark was coated inside and out with pitch, an ancient form of tar or bitumen. So, if we could travel back in time to see the Ark, we wouldn't see a polished wooden ship smelling of cedar. We would see a gigantic black, waterproof coffin floating in a dark storm. The internal prison. This thick black coating perfectly blocked the water, but it created a terrifying new problem. It locked the danger inside. Now, you have thousands of terrified prey animals locked in an airtight, dark space with their natural killers. No way up, no way out. The moment that massive door slammed shut, the Ark instantly became the most dangerous place on Earth. Forget the fantasy of animals coexisting in harmony. Putting lions and zebras together in absolute darkness is a perfect recipe for a massacre. If you let a lion and a zebra roam the same corridor, within 24 hours, this wouldn't be a zoo. It would be a slaughterhouse flowing with blood. To avoid internal collapse, the Ark's internal engineering had to operate with the precision of a maximum security prison. The most logical solution was vertical isolation, placing carnivores and herbivores on different floors. This wasn't random. It was to cut off scent transmission. This was the only physical means to prevent the smell of fresh prey from driving the predators into a frenzy. The original text uses a very specific Hebrew word when describing these rooms: kinim, meaning nests. This word changes everything. We are no longer discussing large cages where animals can run. We are talking about narrow, cramped compartments, almost like insect cocoons. This extreme lack of space was actually a lifesaver. When a 20-meter wave slammed into the side of the Ark, any unsecured object would hit the wall like a cannonball. If the animals had room to walk around, they would have broken their legs and died in agony during the violent shaking. Forced confinement, fixing them in place like cargo, was the only safety guarantee. Furthermore, basic biology tells us that in dark, confined spaces, the survival instincts of most animals are triggered. Their metabolism slows down. They enter a lethargic state similar to hibernation, consuming less energy and, most importantly, eating less. Acoustics and atmosphere. But wooden walls cannot stop an invisible enemy: sound. Imagine the roar of a tiger echoing through a closed wooden gallery, amplified by this giant wooden box like the body of a guitar. This acoustic panic could cause the entire herbivore population to stampede in terror, leading to self-destruction. Maintaining order in this chaos required control bordering on the absurd. However, even if all the animals quieted down and were isolated, there was one thing they couldn't stop: breathing. With thousands of lungs exhaling hot air day and night inside a sealed pitch box, the environment would quickly turn into a massive gas chamber. The Ark wasn't just a shelter. Essentially, it was a biogas bomb waiting to explode. Tons of manure fermenting at the bottom released methane. Add in any torch Noah might light for illumination, and that pile of dry wood could instantly turn into a super fireball in the middle of the ocean. Beyond the explosion risk, there was a silent killer: stale air. Basic chemistry tells us that carbon dioxide is heavier than air. Without forced ventilation, the CO2 exhaled by thousands of animals would sink like water, pooling on the bottom deck. Without air circulation, the animals living on the lower level would simply fall into a coma and suffocate in their sleep. The ventilation engine. The key to survival lay in making this closed box breathe without letting the deadly storm inside. The answer to this engineering puzzle is hidden in a technical detail mentioned in the Bible called the Sohar. The text describes an opening about 1 cubit wide, 45 centimeters, running along the top of the structure. It wasn't a window for sightseeing. There was only death outside. It was a giant nostril. Its operation principle was brilliant. The thousands of warm, living bodies on the bottom deck were the engine themselves. The heat they radiated warmed the surrounding air. Hot air becomes lighter and rises, seeking an exit through the central atrium towards the roof. When this column of hot air rushed out of the top Sohar, it created powerful negative pressure, automatically drawing in fresh, cold air through crevices in the upper levels. This continuous ventilation cycle, driven by biological heat, is known in engineering as the stack effect, or chimney effect. The Ark used the animal's own body heat to pump life-saving oxygen into the abyss. Stability and the center of gravity. The air system was solved, but this solution immediately created a physics nightmare. Since large animals produce more heat and needed to be on the bottom to drive air circulation, This directly affected the ship's center of gravity. If you placed heavy cargo in the wrong spot, the Ark wouldn't just rock when the first lateral wave hit. It would flip upside down and sink within seconds. If Noah made even one calculation error in animal distribution, the ship's lifespan might have been only 5 minutes. Imagine if you placed elephants and rhinos on the top floor to give them fresh air. The top-heavy structure would instantly capsize in the storm. To avoid this disaster, modern shipbuilding follows an iron rule: the difference between a floating ship and an underwater coffin. Weight must be at the bottom. That is why the bottom hold isn't just a place for junk. It is the mechanical core of stability. The heaviest creatures on Earth, elephants, rhinos, hippos, had to be housed below the waterline. They were live ballast. By fixing tons of muscle and bone mass at the bottom, the Ark's center of gravity was pushed extremely low, acting like a giant pendulum anchor. When the storm pushed the Ark to the right, the dead weight at the bottom would forcibly pull the hull back to the left. Physics kept the Ark upright, not luck. Logistics, food, and waste. But this layout created a biological hell. The bottom of any ship is the wettest, coldest, and most disgusting place. All condensation, leakage, and filth flow there. The world's largest animals were locked in near-total darkness, standing on damp planks 24 hours a day. To manage these giants, the environment itself had to be used. The darkness wasn't cruelty. It was a natural, potent sedative. If they remained awake and restless, the food consumption would have been unsustainable. The hold had to become a dormitory for sleeping giants, keeping energy expenditure to a minimum. Now, the ship is stable, and the beasts are asleep. But even in sleep, they need to eat. Here we encounter the logistical deadlock that disproves most Ark theories. How do 8 people feed animals equivalent to an entire city without elevators, forklifts, or electricity? If you think Noah's family spent their days running up and down stairs with buckets, you are naive. With that workload, they would have all died of exhaustion in the first week. Mathematically, pure physical labor was absolutely unfeasible. The only key to unlocking this deadlock was not muscle, but intelligent architectural design. It is highly probable that the middle deck was designed as a strategic distribution center. Think about its location. Away from the dampness of the bottom, where seawater cooled the hull, and away from the scorching heat of the top. This was the driest, most thermally stable place on the ship, the perfect granary for storing tons of grain, hay, and seeds. At sea, mold is as deadly as starvation. If the food rotted, the journey ended immediately. They likely used sealed silos or resin-sealed pottery jars to ensure not a drop of moisture touched the supplies. But the real genius lay in the delivery system. Remember, those massive eating machines were downstairs, directly beneath the food warehouse. The ancients had long mastered the wisdom of using gravity. The Ark likely featured a system of wooden chutes or pipes, connecting the silos on the upper level directly to the troughs below. You simply had to open a gate on the storage deck, and the grain would slide down the pipe, landing precisely at the mouth of the elephant below. No carrying, no wasted calories. An impossible task became a simple daily routine of opening and closing gates. The sanitation crisis. Solving the input problem immediately triggered a more terrifying hygiene crisis: the output problem. Everything that goes in must eventually come out. When thousands of creatures defecate in a closed space, you aren't just facing a mess. You are facing a toxic biochemical environment that can cause blindness. The tons of manure produced daily release ammonia, which, if not cleaned immediately, would quickly burn the eyes and lungs of every living thing. The Ark would turn into a floating septic tank, killing all passengers via plague. Relying on 8 people to clean it with shovels? Impossible. They needed an automatic cleaning system that required no electricity and no flushing. The solution likely lay beneath the floorboards. Ancient farmers already knew a technology: slatted floors. Imagine the floor the animals stood on wasn't solid, but a grid with specific gaps. The genius here was utilizing the most powerful natural force available at the time: the ocean itself. As the waves violently struck and the Ark rocked side to side, gravity did the dirty work. The constant vibration caused by the storm pushed waste through the floor gaps, where it fell into slanted chutes below and was discharged directly into the ocean. Ironically, the very violent rocking that made humans seasick and vomit became the core mechanism for maintaining hygiene. The violence of the flood cleaned the stables. This not only solved the sanitation problem, but also saved freshwater resources that were more precious than gold. The water supply. Speaking of water, this was the next fatal challenge. Although there was enough water outside to cover mountains, drinking a mouthful was suicide. The flood ocean wasn't blue. It was a toxic soup of churning mud, shredded forests, and thousands of rotting corpses. In that environment, it was a high-concentration mixture of bacteria and salt. Filtration technology of the time simply couldn't handle it. The only lifeline came from above. The storm that destroyed the world was also the source of life. The Ark's massive roof area was essentially a super rain collector. Strategically placed wooden gutters would intercept pure rainwater before it touched the dirty hull, channeling it into large cisterns on the upper level. Physics steps in again. Water is heavy. If you stored water at the bottom and tried to haul it up, human stamina would drain instantly. But by storing drinking water at the top, gravity handled the distribution for free. You simply pulled a plug in a bamboo pipe, and water flowed with pressure down to the drinking troughs on the lower levels. Rain filled the top, gravity delivered the drink, and waves cleaned the bottom. This giant machine ran almost automatically. Psychological fortress. However, having a ship that could breathe, self-clean, and sustain itself wasn't enough. If the mines operating it collapsed, everything would be for naught. On the top deck of this wooden fortress, 8 human hearts bore an unimaginable psychological burden. They were the sole survivors of their entire species. That isolation alone was enough to crush anyone. While the bottom was a dim dormitory for beasts, the upper deck was the only place that vaguely resembled home. According to shipbuilding logic, light cargo, humans and birds, had to stay at the top to maintain balance. But this was also a biological mercy: distance. Being 2 floors above the waste zone determined whether you slept soundly or spent the night vomiting from the smell of ammonia. The upper deck was the command center and the only place to see daylight. However, the only light source described in the Bible, the Sohar, was on the roof. What does this mean? It means you could look at the sky, but you couldn't look at the sea. This created a brutal yet merciful psychological effect. Imagine, for 370 days, you could not see the horizon. You saw no scenery, no ocean, only the heavens. This might have been a carefully designed psychological protection mechanism. If there were side windows, Noah's family would have been forced to watch the apocalypse from front row seats. They would have seen cities collapse, mountains disappear, and most terrifyingly, countless familiar faces and bodies floating in the water. The skylight acted like blinders, shielding the survivors' sanity from the hellscape outside. But they had no time to stare blankly. The schedule there was military. No weekends, no holidays, just endless checking, feeding, and maintenance. The sealed door, submarine mode. All these precise survival technologies depended on one final critical action. Cutting a hole in the side of a ship is a shipbuilding taboo, but the Ark required a massive entrance for animals to board, a giant cargo ramp. When open, the Ark was just a fragile wooden box waiting to be flooded. The most heart-stopping moment wasn't when the rain started falling, but when that giant door closed. The Bible records a chilling detail. It wasn't Noah who shut the door, but God shut him in. Physically, this makes perfect sense. To make such a massive wooden door absolutely watertight against the pressure of a raging ocean required a force beyond 8 people. When that door slammed shut and the pitch-coated seams cut off the last ray of light, visual reality changed instantly. It was as if someone turned off the sun. The gray light of the storm vanished, replaced by the flickering glimmer of torches. At that moment, the Ark was no longer a building. It became a fully enclosed capsule, a surface submarine. This total visual isolation was terrifying, yet necessary for survival. If the door had a glass window, watching the world being torn apart outside would have driven the crew insane. The sealed door was a guarantee of life, but also a sentence of imprisonment. They were safe, but utterly trapped in the dark, drifting with the waves. The landing. After being tossed in the dark for over 300 days, surfacing was easy, but coming down was the real test. Landing such a behemoth on rugged terrain filled with mud without wheels or shock absorbers was the final life-or-death structural test. The Ark stopped, but not gracefully like a cruise ship docking. The terrain of the world had changed drastically. The scripture says it came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. This means this giant wooden box, with no brakes and no steering, had to brutally run aground on raw, irregular rock. If it had a V-shaped hull, the moment it touched the ground, it would have tilted and toppled over, crushing all the animals and crew into pulp right at the finish line. It was that flat bottom, designed for stability at sea, that saved them once again. It acted like a massive concrete foundation, allowing the Ark to sit steadily on the jagged rocks. The screeching sound of wood scraping against stone must have been the most beautiful yet terrifying sound they had ever heard. When Noah finally removed the covering of the roof, the impact wasn't just visual, it was sensory. Eyes adapted to a year of dim light were suddenly stung by unfiltered sunlight. Fresh air rushed into lungs, dispelling the stale ammonia and mold. But what greeted them wasn't a green paradise. It was a world that had been thoroughly washed. Silent, desolate, covered in thick, dried mud. The earth had been forcibly rebooted. Conclusion. Noah's Ark wasn't a mythical miracle that solved problems with the wave of a magic wand. It was an engineering feat demonstrating extreme technical obedience. God didn't snap his fingers to preserve biodiversity. He provided a detailed engineering blueprint. Survival required physics, biology, fluid dynamics, waste management, and near-steel mental discipline. This proves one truth. Faith does not reject hard scientific labor. Quite the opposite. Faith guided it. Now, click the video on the screen to see exactly how the construction details of Noah's Ark were achieved step by step. That is true engineering shock and awe.